This is continuous coverage.
Continuous coverage.
In the trial of Lori Vallow Daybell from the Hidden Killers podcast.
Welcome back to our continuous coverage. This is segment number 1 of 4 from the 27th of April, 2023, in the trial of Lori Vallow Daybell. Let's go to the courtroom.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bailiff. Please be seated. All right. Good morning, everyone. We are on the record on case CR 22-21-1624, State of Idaho versus Lori Noreen Vallow. The state is continuing with presenting evidence in its case in chief. Court notes all the jurors are here, properly seated and accounted for. I understand they've all signed their juror affirmation today. Is that correct, Mr. Bailiff?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you for that confirmation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, again for your continued service and your continued compliance with the court's admonishment each evening when we break. The parties and the court appreciate it very much. At this time, then, the state was conducting direct examination of Dr. Angie Christensen, who has returned to the stand today. I'll remind you, Dr. Christensen, you're still under oath for your testimony. With that in mind, Ms. Smith, if you'd like to continue with your direct examination, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let me return just briefly to item 16, if I may. Yesterday when we were, during your testimony, you mentioned that there were multiple sharp deficits in item 16. Do you recall?
Yes.
And I could not remember whether we had identified those for the jurors. So if you could, please take a look at State's Exhibit 181C. And if you could, there should be a pointer up there. I believe you had said there were 5 indications of sharp trauma in this part of the pelvis bone. Do I have that right?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Could you identify those for the jurors, please?
So the one that I identified as number 1 is here. This one is alteration number 2. Number 3 here is actually visible on both sides of this innominate. So the one indicated by 3 is the same alteration, which is visible from both sides. And the same for number 4. This is number 4 from one side of the bone, which can also be observed on the other side. And alteration number 5 is here.
Okay. Now, you said innominate. Did I say that right?
Innominate is the same as the hip bone.
Okay. And this is which side of the hip again?
This is the left side.
Okay. And in identifying these various sharp items, you had indicated that some of these appeared inconsistent with dismemberment. Do I remember that correct?
Yes, the general location of these sharp alterations in the pelvic region is inconsistent with what's typically seen in cases of dismemberment.
Okay. In this particular bone?
Well, in these particular locations on the bone.
Okay. And so you did receive a lot of bones that were apart, correct?
Yes, many of the bones I received were disarticulated or separated from one another and also fragmentary or in multiple pieces.
Okay. But this particular bone has some areas where some of the marks are inconsistent with dismemberment.
Inconsistent with what's typically seen in cases of dismemberment, yes, that I've observed or read about in case studies.
Okay. The other bones that you examined, did you examine vertebra?
Yes.
Okay. And when you examined vertebra, did you see evidence that is consistent? Did you see any evidence of sharp trauma to the vertebra?
I did not see any sharp alterations on the vertebrae.
Okay.
But my recollection is that many of the vertebrae were either thermally altered or fragmentary and damaged. So I can't exclude the possibility that sharp trauma was present and subsequently destroyed or not visible.
Okay. And I believe a little later we'll see some pictures of that, but I wanted to kind of put that in context for us. And so you saw lots of different bones, and you can't comment on what was on the bones that had extensive thermal damage.
The ones that were thermally damaged are for the most part, highly fragmentary, and I didn't observe any sharp traumas on those bones.
Okay. Doesn't mean they weren't there, it just means you didn't observe any.
I can't say one way or the other. I can't exclude the possibility, but of the material that I did examine, I did not find sharp alterations on those other bones other than these three.
Okay. And when you say these three, this is the first item we've talked about, item 16?
Yes, the left and right innominate and the sacrum.
Okay. And item 16 is the left?
Correct.
All right. This remains item 16. It is State's Exhibit 181E. Are these close-ups of those sharp trauma items you've discussed?
Yes, these are close-up views of several of the same sharp alterations in the previous photographs.
Okay. And in your report, I believe you used the word puncture. Is that correct?
I don't recall the exact language I used in my report.
Okay.
If you would like me to refer to my report, I can do that.
No, I think that's okay. I just want to make sure I understood. When you say sharp alterations, it is not your job to say what instrument caused those.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Now, you indicated three items. Let's take a look at State's item 19. It's 181F. Or your item 19. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
What's that?
This is the right innominate or right hip bone, annotated with arrows indicating sharp alterations.
Okay. And how many sharp alterations were in the right hip bone?
There were 6 on the right hip bone.
Okay. Could you identify those for the jurors just so it's clear?
Sure. 5 of the 6 are depicted in these photographs. Number 1 being here. 2 not visible in either of these 2 views. 3 and 4 and 5, which again is visible from both views and so indicated on both images, and alteration number 6.
Okay. And now, are these items consistent with other situations of dismemberment trauma, or inconsistent?
The location of these sharp alterations is not consistent with what I've previously observed in dismemberment cases.
Okay. And if I could, to orient us, let's take a look back at 182B. Just so that I understand what you mean, again, by hip bone. I put up 182B. Could you take a look at us and show us again that right hip bone?
This is the right hip bone.
Okay. So sometimes I think of the hip bone sort of like, when I'm carrying a baby, they're on my hip. So I think of it as that edge. Is that what you refer to as just the edge?
Yes, so that edge that you're talking about is called the iliac crest, and it's the part of the hip bone at the top side of the hip bone.
Okay. And so, but the entire hip bone extends down, correct?
Yes.
So the edge is what a lot of us think of as what you would call the iliac crest?
Yes.
All right. But then the entire surface extends down into the pelvis.
Correct.
All right. And so the items that you've identified, and you pointed to it on State's Exhibit 182B, that area of the pelvis is where again? If you could show us.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
No problem. That area of the lower pubis area is where?
That is located here.
Okay. And in that area, did you see evidence of sharp trauma?
I believe we did discuss one sharp trauma on the left hip bone yesterday.
Okay. And so when you're saying hip bone, you mean that the entire bone that kind of curves like a C?
Yes, the hip bone encompasses this entire portion here.
Okay. Let's take a look at State's Exhibit 181F, which is another view of your item 19, which again is that right hip bone. Is that right?
Yes, but I think this may be the same one that we just looked at with
I apologize.
5 of the 6.
Okay. And you've identified all of those, correct?
Correct.
All right. Did you also take the radiograph and the x-rays of this one?
Yes.
Okay. Let me show you 181G. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want me to zoom in if I can, or no? I'm going to ask you to identify him on the radiograph.
Okay, I think I can do that from this view.
Can you please identify the items you've discussed and identified in the larger picture?
The sharp traumas?
Yes, ma'am.
So sharp trauma number 1, or what I've identified as number 1, is here. Number 2 is here. 3 and 4. 5, again, visible in both views and labeled on both views. And number 6.
Okay. And number 6 is in a regular color photo, correct?
Yes, number 6 is what's depicted in the photograph above.
Okay. And those are all evidence of sharp trauma to that area?
Yes.
And this area, and it may be just my view, so forgive me if I'm not oriented correctly, which area is sharp trauma number 1 in? Is it towards the top of the hip bone or towards the bottom of, sort of lower in the hip bone?
Number 1 is in the pubic region.
Okay. And number 2 would be where?
Number 2 is in a region called the ischial region. It's basically, if you would like to show the photograph of the bone, it might be easier for me to point it out there.
Do you want the diagram or the?
Sure, the diagram.
Sure.
So the ischium is basically this part right back here. So it's toward it's sort of the part of your hip that you're sitting on.
Okay. All right. Now you indicated there was a third bone. Is that documented in your items, the images of item 17,
Yes,
where we found the additional sharp trauma?
I believe that was item 17.
17, thank you. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
What is that?
These are photographs taken as part of my examination.
Okay. Of what particular item?
This is can you move it down just a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. It's hard for me to tell what is
okay.
visible.
This is the item 17 sacrum, which in these images here are still attached to several of the lumbar vertebrae.
And did you identify any sharp trauma in this area?
Yes, there was one sharp alteration on the left side, which is indicated here, annotated number 1. And looking at the whole bone, that's approximately this location here.
Okay. And that is the sacrum?
That's the sacrum, yes.
Okay. Let me show you just for to orient us again, is States Exhibit 182A. Where is the sacrum in relation to the pelvis that you've shown us?
The sacrum makes up the back of the pelvis and the bottom of the spinal column.
Okay. So is it that item that appears to kind of be between the two hip bones?
Yes.
Okay. And that area towards the bottom is where you saw evidence of sharp trauma?
It's not toward the bottom, actually. It's, if you bring back
Sure.
the diagram, I can.
Sure.
That sharp trauma on the sacrum was approximately here.
And did that sharp trauma appear in any way sort of in line or near any other sharp trauma you saw?
There were sharp traumas on the left hip bone that were in that general area.
Okay. And let me show you an image which appears to be an X-ray of item 17, which is States 181I. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
Sorry, it's hard to orient. There we go. And again, this is what area of the body?
This is the sacrum and 4 of the lumbar vertebrae.
Okay. And in this view, in the X-ray view, could you see any evidence of sharp trauma?
No.
Okay. And so the images of the sacrum that we previously saw had some evidence of sharp trauma?
Yes, it's just that it's not very easily visible in a radiograph like this.
Okay. Thank you. One moment, please. Let me check with the team. The state has nothing else, Your Honor. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Smith. Who will be doing cross-examination?
I will, Judge.
All right, Mr. Thomas, you may conduct your cross.
Oh, there you go. Sorry. You gotta watch me.
Morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
You talked a little bit about how these the injuries that were on this particular case were not consistent with what you would normally see in a dismemberment type case, right?
That's correct.
And let's just go there. How many dismemberment cases do you think that you've done over your career?
A handful.
A handful? More than 10?
Probably fewer than 10.
Fewer than 10? Okay. So what makes, I guess I don't understand what's a typical dismemberment type case?
Well, in addition to my own case experience, I also am constantly reading the forensic literature, and I've read a number of case studies and reports and research papers related to dismemberment cases. Typically, the purpose of dismemberment is to disarticulate the body into smaller portions, and that is usually accomplished by cutting around joints, which is not what I observed in this case.
And what kind of, so you're not the tool mark expert, right? That goes to somebody else.
Right.
I think you said that earlier.
Yes.
Okay. And so your job is to decide which bones were human and which ones were not human? Is that kind of what your job was on this particular case?
So in this case, the material was everything that I observed was human in origin, and I was asked to identify any signs of potential trauma on the skeletal remains. In my laboratory, our procedure, if there are traumas that may have been imparted by a tool, that those are additionally and further examined by our firearms and tool marks unit.
Okay. So everything that was sent to you, you knew were already human bones?
They were identified to me as being human remains, but as part of my examination, I did determine that they were human in origin, or in some cases, some of the bones, excuse me, were so fragmentary that I wasn't able to conclude that they were definitively human.
Okay. But your main job was to decide sharp trauma versus other types of trauma on the bones?
To identify and differentiate any trauma to determine what its potential source was, and as a means of narrowing down which bones might be examined by other units.
Okay. And so there was a lot of questioning and direction towards the hip area and the pelvic bone. The top of the femur comes up into a ball, right, where the hip meets the femur?
Correct, yes.
Okay. And so some of the trauma was around the pelvic region in that particular area of the hip joint, right?
It was mostly most of the sharp traumas were on what's called the ilium, which is that big blade-like part of the pelvic bone.
Okay. But some of the trauma was on the near within inches of the ball joint of the femur, right?
I would have to look at the images again, but I don't think any of them were directly on that socket or that joint area.
Right. Not on that socket, but near that socket.
I mean, none of it is very far from that socket, because of the size of the bone. But yes, some of them were in that general neighborhood. I didn't measure the distance from the socket.
Okay. So when someone is So when someone is trying to dismember a body, what is your understanding of, in your past cases, what is your understanding of how that's done? Is it generally, let me withdraw that question. In this particular case, what types of instruments do you think were used based on your professional experience, based on your training, based on your research and your review of other articles? What types of instruments do you think were used on this particular case?
This is not within the scope of my examinations. This is the toolmark examiners.
Okay. So your job was just to define, or just to say, yes, this was some sort of trauma, and then you move it on to somebody else to decide which type of trauma?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And how long did you review these bones? I mean, like, I guess I don't know how long it takes to take these bones, view them, do CT scans. How long was your particular job here?
I don't recall, but if you look at my examination notes, each page is dated. So my examination started on the date of the first page of my examination notes and ended on the date of my final report.
And do you have those examination notes with you?
I provided them to the prosecution when I walked in today, but I don't have them in front of me.
Okay, so if we got them in front of you, you'd be able to tell us?
Yes.
All right, let's do that.
All right, Mr. Bailey, if you please provide those to the witness.
Thank you. So in this case, I began my examination on August 23 of 2020 and completed my final report on September 22, 2020.
Okay. And was this the only case you worked on during the time between August 3rd and September 20?
I don't recall, but generally I'm only working one case at a time.
Okay. All right. Thank you. No further questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Thomas. Does the state have any redirect?
Very briefly, Judge.
Very well. Does the witness still have those case notes? Okay, let's have those returned, please.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Doctor, just a quick question. Defense counsel asked you can't tell what type of implement, what actual instrument caused the traumas you observed, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. However, you have used the phrase sharp trauma.
Yes.
Why do you, if you can't tell the specific tool, how do you determine it was actually caused by sharp trauma?
So because sharp trauma refers to trauma that was imparted with an object with a very small surface area. And this can be differentiated from blunt trauma, which is trauma imparted by an object with a relatively large surface area, and projectile trauma, which is imparted by an object moving at a very high rate of speed with a small surface area.
Okay. And when you say small surface area, is that because of the size and shape of the trauma you saw inflicted on Tylee's bones?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I have nothing further.
All right, thank you, Ms. Smith. That will conclude then the testimony of this witness. Is the witness allowed to be released from any subpoena?
The state would ask that she has
We have no objection.
All right, thank you, Mr. Thomas. So thank you again for your testimony. You are excused, and the bailiff will assist you out of the courtroom.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, I take it Ms. Rawlings, you'll be calling the next witness? Very well. Who is the witness? Very well. We'll have them brought in and sworn.
If he keeps it closed, I think it's okay.
All right, now that the witness is sworn, I just have a couple of questions. Have you reviewed or seen or heard or read any of the trial testimony that's taken place in this case since it started?
No, sir, I have not.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll just advise you then, please, as you are testifying, make verbal responses to any questions you're answering and try to avoid talking at the same time as any attorney questioning you so we can keep the record clear. With those ground rules in mind, Ms. Rawlings, if you'd like to inquire on direct, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you please state your name and spell it for the record?
Douglas Halapaska. That's DOUGLASHALEPASKA.
Thank you. Where are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Laboratory Division. I work at Quantico, Virginia, as a forensic examiner in the Firearms and Tool Marks Unit. Forensic examiner in the Firearms and Tool Marks Unit. Sure.
Can you explain what training and expertise you have to work as a physical scientist at the Firearms and Tool Marks Unit?
Okay. The training is essentially on-the-job training. For me, that training lasted a little over 2.5 years. When I first arrived in the unit, I received a lengthy and extensive training syllabus, which outlined a curriculum of study within the discipline of tool mark identification. During that time, I had the opportunity to be under the direct supervision of a senior qualified tool mark examiner. Throughout that training period, I was able to assist this qualified examiner with actual training samples as well as actual evidence samples as well. I was able to tour several firearms, ammunition, and tool manufacturing facilities, which is critical in the training period because it allows for us to actually firsthand see the examination or the manufacture of the tools themselves. Toward the end of the training, I was required to take and pass a series of written, competency, and oral examinations. And once I passed my final oral examinations, I then actually qualified as a firearms and tool marks examiner within the FBI laboratory.
Thank you.
FBI laboratory?
We are getting a little feedback on that microphone, but we're not able to make adjustments, unfortunately, today. We've had a little bit of a technical issue, and it's supposed to be improved, hopefully, over the noon hour, but we're sort of limited on ability to control that. So,
Could I try to not use the microphone and just project my voice? Would that be?
we still need the microphone to pick up the recording for the record, so maybe you can just actually push the mic a little away from you, potentially.
Okay. That was a pretty extensive answer. Do you have any other noteworthy information from your CV?
That I'm a member of the Association of Firearms and Tool Mark Examiner. That's a organization in which professional organization I'm a member of. They provide training. There's a yearly conference, and there's a journal with topics that arrive within the discipline. So that as well.
Thank you. You have been employed at the lab in Quantico for over 13 years now?
That is correct.
Okay. And how is evidence submitted to the lab at Quantico?
The evidence arrives typically FedEx, but there are some hand-delivered evidence.
And once the evidence is received, what happens next?
The evidence arrives in the Evidence Management Unit, the acronym's EMU. They just assure that when the evidence arrives, that the packaging it arrived in is intact. They itemize the evidence. They enter the data from the evidence into a software system called Forensic Advantage. In it, they actually issue a unique identifier for the case, as well as unique identifiers for each piece of evidence. Most importantly, they put together an evidence plan. So there's different disciplines within the laboratory system. So they basically put together an examination plan. And they also deliver the evidence between the different units. So the different disciplines, once they're completed their examinations, they would just drop off that evidence in a particular evidence storage facility, and the evidence management personnel would actually pick it up and deliver it to the next unit.
So what process do you follow when evidence arrives at the firearms tool marks unit?
Okay. That evidence arrives in a drop-off facility, access the pickup facility as well for evidence. Once that arrives, either an examiner or a technician will pick up that evidence. Once that's done, if active examinations do not start, they will actually just place that evidence into a storage facility within the unit itself.
Do you recall what evidence you checked out of the evidence locker in reference to this case?
That would be items 16, 17, and 19.
And what agency did these bones come from?
They came from the Ada County Coroner's Office.
And do you know if there was an agency reference number associated with those bones?
Yes, there was.
Do you remember what that was?
I believe it was 2006-11-61. But if you don't mind, would I check my notes?
Your Honor, may he refresh his recollection to verify that the number is correct?
Well, he can be provided his notes, and then we'll see if the defense has any objection to that.
I believe he has a closed copy of a folder up there that he can reference if that's okay.
Can I take a look at it?
Have you seen it?
I have not.
Okay, yeah, the defense is entitled to review that first.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Thomas, there's been a request that the witness be allowed to refresh their recollection using the notes. Is there any objection from the defense?
No objection.
All right, as you do that, Mr. Halapaska, please indicate if you are referring to your notes and don't just read off them, and close the file once you've refreshed your recollection, so you're testifying from memory and not from the notes themselves.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
I'm just on the first page of my laboratory report, page 1 of 4. There's
Are you reading? Is he reading from the note?
Oh, no.
I think we just asked not
Yeah,
to read
that's
that.
Yes.
Mr. Halapaska, I had just asked you what the agency number was, and I think you wanted to just verify that your recitation was correct. So if you can just look and then.
Yes, it was 2006-11-61. That's correct.
Thank you. Now let's talk about how you review the evidence and draft a report. Can you explain what you do first?
Okay. There's a couple of terms and definitions I'd like to define. It may take a little while, but okay. The first thing I want to talk about is a tool.
You know, I'm going to ask that a question be asked. It seems like it was a very broad question, and now he's going to go into a narrative, I believe.
All right, I'll sustain that objection if you want to ask a new question, Ms. Rawlings.
So my question was what you do first. So if you could just give the first part of what you do when you're reviewing evidence and drafting your report, and then we can go forward.
The first thing I do is I review the evidence. So I remove the evidence from the evidence packaging, ensuring that the identifiers on that packaging are consistent with those within the forensic advantage system. Once that occurs, I'm actually going to start reviewing that evidence for any kind of tool marks. Once any kind of tool marks are identified, I'm actually going to document that in my notes. There's some worksheets that I add that information to, either imagery or handwritten.
And Mr. Halapaska, I think you mentioned you also use some definitions when you're crafting your notes. What are those?
Okay, so the first one is a tool. So the basic definition of a tool is to gain mechanical advantage over some object. But when the discipline of tool mark identification, a tool can be thought of is when two objects come into forceful contact with each other, and the harder of the two objects is the tool, and the softer the two objects, the tool mark.
Okay, thank you. What do you do next in drafting your report?
When I'm drafting my report, I'm actually taking the information from my notes. The notes are used as reference to the report. The report's generated in Forensic Advantage, the software system for the laboratory, and then I generate the report from those notes.
And what specific items did you look at for your report?
Those would be items 16, 17, and 19.
Did you use something called casting material?
Yes, I did.
Can you explain what item that was and what casting material is?
I believe that was item 106. So anytime material is used from evidence items, it becomes secondary evidence. Casting material is basically a silicone-based compound. It's administered onto a surface as a thick liquid. Once that substance dries, it dries into a rubberized material, and it actually picks up castings of the item itself, the tool marks.
Thank you. And did you explain how you used that material in your analysis, the casting material?
Yes, there was a few items or tool marks on the items that I actually took castings of. So I actually took 5 castings from those evidence items, and that's what became item 106, which was the secondary evidence.
And that is specifically the casting material?
That is correct.
Okay. Does your report go through a review process?
Yes, it does.
Can you explain how that works?
It first goes through a technical review. That's where another qualified firearms and tool mark examiner reviews both my notes as well as my report for technical accuracy. Once that's completed, it goes through an administrative report or administrative review. That's done by another individual. Doesn't necessarily have to be a qualified tool mark examiner, and they're just checking for spelling and grammar accuracy and stuff like that.
And are there any other specific terms that you use when drafting your report that we should know about?
There's a handful of terms I like to define.
Okay.
The first one is, so I talked about a tool within the discipline. So when two objects come into forceful contact with each other, the softer of the two is the tool mark. There's two types of tool marks. There's impressed and striated. An impressed mark occurs when the force onto an object is perpendicular. So the best way to kind of think about that is whenever you're at the beach, you got a bowling ball, you drop that bowling ball into the sand, you remove that bowling ball, that's your impression. Striated marks occur when both force is applied to an object almost perpendicular to the surface, and it generates striations or essentially scratch marks. Those are the only two types of tool marks that occur. There's two other important terms, class characteristics and individual characteristics.
Okay, what are class characteristics?
Okay, class characteristics are the general or measurable features of a specimen that which indicate a restricted group source or source population. These are design factors and are determined prior to manufacture. So what I'm talking about is tools. The best analogy I can think of right now is if you had two types of screwdrivers, one being a flathead screwdriver. If you were to use that flathead screwdriver to make an impression, that impression would have basically the general shape of a minus sign in mathematics. But it would also have other features. There would be measurable features such as the width of that tool head, as well as the length of it. Now, when I'm talking about the screwdriver, I'm only concerned with the working surface. So basically, that part of the screwdriver that you're using to torque that screw. That's the only part I'm concerned with. That's the part that is manufactured. Other class characteristics are the manufacturing processes that occur on the working surface of that flathead screwdriver. So was that flathead screwdriver made, was it casted? Was it milled? Was it fractured? Finishing processes, grinding, bead blasting, coating. Those are class characteristics. The other kind of screwdriver, a Phillips head, and a press mark from a Phillips head would look like a plus sign. So if I had tool marks that had the general impression of minus and plus, I have two separate source populations. So that is an easy way to think of class characteristics. Individual characteristics, they are the rapid and random imperfections that occur to a tool surface. These occur during the manufacturing process, and they're incidental to the manufacturing process. So the manufacturer does not intend for the working surface of these screwdrivers to have these marks on them. But these marks are what are used to source identify a tool mark back to a particular tool. And there's an examination process I could walk through looking at class characteristics in an individual, or is that?
What is that process, Mr. Halapaska?
Okay, so during the first half, as I told you earlier, I'm focused on documenting those class characteristics into my notes. So what I'm doing is I'm documenting those class characteristics into my notes. That's the first half of the examination process. Once that's done, I take all those different source populations of class characteristics, and I go to the next level of examination, which is the using the comparison microscope. So essentially, it's the microscopic examination of those individual characteristics. The best way to think of a comparison microscope is essentially you have two compound microscopes with an optical bridge, which allows me to look at two separate samples under the same viewing field, under the same magnification. So at that time, I'm actually looking at patterns of similarity between those two samples. And that's what I use to source identify a tool mark back to a particular tool. That's in a nutshell, essentially, the examination process.
Thank you. Turning your attention to the items you examined in your report, the first item that you examined was numbered 16. Do you remember what that was?
It was a bone.
Okay. I'm going to hand you what's been marked as States Exhibits 180A through L. And I would note for the record that defense counsel and the court has been provided courtesy copies.
All right.
And Mr. Halapaska, there is water in the pitcher if you need any water.
Thank you.
If I could have just a second with counsel.
Yes. Mr. Thomas, if you'd like to, why don't you walk over here? We'll turn on the white noise. Oh, I'm sorry. We don't have that available, but still, if you walk over here, it's better than over there.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Halapaska, will you take a minute and look at each of those pages, those images? Thank you. Do you recognize those images?
Yes, I do.
How do you recognize them?
I recognize them based on some information that I actually wrote on the bone. Anytime I wrote any kind of identifier on the bone, I would write my initials as well as digital boxes and lettering that I've added to the to the photographs.
Okay. And when were these photos taken approximately?
Between the examination period, which I believe was from February of 2021 to October of 2021.
And you mentioned that some of the photographs have marks on them and some appear to have writing on the bones. Did you place those marks on the photographs and the bones?
Yes, I did.
Are these images a true and accurate depiction of the bones that you analyzed?
They are.
And besides the marks that you made on the photographs or the bones, are there any material alterations or deletions to the images?
No, there were not.
Your Honor, I would move for the admission of States Exhibits 180A through L.
Any objection from the defense?
With the explanation of the photographs where he's written on the actual bones and on the photographs, I have no objection to their admission.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thomas. So exhibits 180A through L are all admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I have permission to publish those to the jury?
Yes, you may.
Okay.
So, Mr. Halapaska, the first, I know I have a softer voice, so I'm going to place on the Elmo as 180A. Maybe this will be, no, because we want the scale. How about that? Does that work?
That's good.
Okay. All right. And what bone is this?
I believe that's the hip bone or the pelvic region.
Okay. Can you walk us through your analysis of this bone?
Would it be possible for me to clarify a few terms? I'm going to be using repeatedly through all these images.
All right. What terms that you need to clarify that we haven't gone over?
Action type, stabbing action, chopping, and compressive force.
Okay. So what's...
Compressive force.
So I think you said the first one was action type?
Yes.
What is
action
that?
type, for a stabbing action, it could be thought of as essentially force that's being generated from the tip of a tool onto a surface. So that energy will be focused on a single point of that tool. A chopping action you could think of as essentially when that energy is being delivered from a bladed tool along the long axis of that cutting surface. Compressive force I use in my report basically just to outline any kind of damage to the bone that I was unable to determine any kind of class characteristics other than the fact that some force was applied onto it.
Okay. And was that all the terms that you needed to clarify?
I believe so.
Okay. Thank you. I didn't want to miss any. So with regard to Exhibit 180A, I believe there are 4 areas that are kind of outlined on this. Do you have a laser pointer up there with you?
Yes, I do.
Would you like to use it?
I would.
Okay.
Thank you.
If you'd please just walk us through those areas.
Okay, so you can see the bone here, and these are actually the outlines, the digital outline that I drew around the damaged regions, and then I lettered each one of them. So starting with A, that I determined was a cause from a stabbing type action. Over to B here, which was a chopping type action, and then C and D, chopping type action.
Okay. Now turning your attention to State's Exhibit 180B.
If it's possible, could I just focus on the top image? I mean, for now.
All right, so with regard to State's Exhibit 180B, this top image, what does that show?
This is Region A, which I said was caused from a stabbing action. You can see here I've actually written on the bone A, and then next to it is my initials, DJH. The illustrations, I have those there essentially to kind of outline the damage that was occurred to the bone.
So this image is a close-up of image, or what was marked as tool mark A in the previous photo. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And the reason I took the close-up image is what I was trying to do is I was trying to document the damage that occurred to the bone. It's a little difficult to see here, but you could actually see some of the bone here has begun to fracture, and the force of the impact came down at a perpendicular angle. So this fracturing that's occurring here has been driven into the bone. The bone actually has a hard layer, and there's a hollow layer inside. So this penetrated that hard layer into the hollow layer, and actually I don't capture it here, but there was damage that was occurred onto the other side of the bone that was occurred from here. What's not captured on the screen is the arrow right here. There's actual radial cracks coming out of the damaged area right here that I was trying to actually document in this photograph.
And what other actions did you take in reviewing or analyzing tool mark A on this hip bone?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, first half of my examination is focused on those class characteristics. The second half, I'm wanting to actually identify those individual characteristics. I was examining it, looking for those individual characteristics. I was unable to locate any. So that's when I decided to use the casting material. Again, this that silicone-based compound, kind of comes with thick liquid. I applied it into the damaged area, allowed it to harden, removed it. I actually did this 2 times, and I was unable to identify any individual characteristics from this damaged area.
Is there a light on here? Because that image is, yeah, I'm trying to make it lighter. Oh, thank you. That bottom image is a little dark. Are you able to see that?
I can.
Okay. And what is that bottom image, if you can describe it for the record?
It's the same image as the one that was at the top. However, it's just more focused. The magnification was increased. It just illustrates the fracturing that occurred and that bone being carried inside the damaged area. So essentially just a magnified version of the first photograph that you saw.
Thank you. Now, looking at State's Exhibit 180C, the top picture, can you describe this for the record?
Right. The damaged area is here. Again, you can see the identifier I gave it, B, my initials, and the arrow is just kind of outlining the fractures that occurred. You can see some of the fracturing of the bone that's occurring. It's being driven downward. This again came from a chopping tap action. The energy of that long axis of that blade is being driven down. This appears to have come from a perpendicular angle. It didn't drive into the all the way through the hard layer of the bone, but right here you can see basically part of the bone, the harder, being driven inside that damaged area. I did take castings from this as well. I took 2 casts trying to identify individual characteristics. From my examination process, I was unable to identify any individual characteristics from this injury.
Did you know anything else is significant with this tool mark identified as B?
No,
Okay. Did you take any other actions in reviewing or analyzing it?
no, I did not.
Okay. And then with regard to the bottom image on State's Exhibit 180C, can you please explain what we are seeing there?
Essentially, it's the same image as the first one, just magnified, so you can actually see the B here. But what I was wanting to illustrate is you could actually see, again, this injury did not pierce through the hard layer of the bone, so you can actually see at the base of that tool mark residual bone fragments that were carried into it. So that was what I was trying to illustrate with that image.
All right, now in State's Exhibit 180D, there are multiple images on this page. So if we can just start at the top. Does this contain close-up images of the tool marks you noted as C and D in that very first photograph?
They do.
All right. And why did you take a closer-up picture of the tool marks you identified as C and D?
I was just trying to better capture the damage to document it in these images.
All right. What did you know as significant with these tool marks?
Okay. Looking at the top left image, you can again see how I've labeled them C and D. Again, my initials, DJH. The green arrow, I use it to illustrate that this was a chopping type action, and that the force of this chopping type action, at least in this image, occurred from left to right.
Okay. And when you talk about chopping type actions, are you able to identify the type of tools in any of these marks that we've looked at that leave these?
I wasn't able to identify it to a particular tool, but there were tool types that I was actually able to speculate could have caused these marks that are essentially chopping tap action, are terms I would use was consistent with certain types of tools.
And what are those tools?
In this type of chopping tap action, as I have stated in my report, it would be from a bladed tool, such as a cleaver, machete, and I believe a hatchet I used.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you need to note on the top two images?
There is on the top right. Again, you can kind of see my initials right here. So what I did was I just focused inward onto this, onto the damaged area, and you can see this crack occurring right here. It illustrates basically that the force came from this side, and it drove or fractured part of this bone, and it's kind of driving it inside that damaged area. As you may be able to see, this damage cut through the hard layer of the bone, and it actually transferred to the other side of the bone as well. The black arrows here on the right side, they're illustrating basically scallop-shaped surfaces that were found along the tool mark, which indicate to me that there may have been some type of serrated teeth on the blade to produce those. Those are actually easier to see, if we can. So see right here, this cut or this chopping type action either didn't cut through the hard surface of that bone, but it carried a lot of material into it. You see the black arrow actually pointing out these teeth structures kind of coming out. I believe that bladed tool had some type of serrated teeth on it, kind of like saw teeth, like you see on saw. And as it was being delivered through a chopping type action, caused those to flare up. And then you can see the green arrow here, which indicates that the force came from, at least in the image, from left to right.
Thank you. Now looking at State's Exhibit 180E, the top image on that, what does that show?
I'm sorry, could I clarify one more point from the last image?
Sure, let me grab that one again. The bottom? Do you want the bottom?
The only thing I want to mention is when I went in and I was looking for those individual characteristics, I was unable to find them in either C or D.
Okay. All right, so looking at States Exhibit 180E, there are two images on this page. The top image, what is that documenting?
This is the same bone, item 16. This is just the backside of the bone.
Okay, and why did you take a picture of the backside of the bone with these marks on it?
As I mentioned earlier, the tool marks that I identified on the front side, A and D, I said some of that damage was transferred onto the backside. So region A, as I mentioned earlier, that was from a stabbing type action, and that damage transferred through the bone. So that damage actually carried through the two hard layers and didn't necessarily come out of the bone, but fractured it so that that tool partially pushed that or ejected that material onto the outside of the bone here. Region D.
And Mr. Halapaska, if I can just interrupt, are you able to say what type of tool would make that stab mark identified in Mark A?
I believe it was some type of bladed tool, so like a knife. However, I couldn't preclude other tools that might have some type of pointed edge, because you can imagine even a cleaver, if it's delivered on not the long axis of the blade, but one of the corners, may have been able to produce this. But this is consistent with a bladed tool such as a knife.
And what else did you notice significant on this bone?
That D here, that was that chopping type action that I talked about earlier on the front side. I told you some of that damage was transferred onto the back, and you can actually see how it pierced through both the hard layer of the bone on the other side, traveled through that hollow part of the inside, and then partially out on the outside. And then E was another tool mark that I identified. It is consistent with a chopping type action, and it did appear to have serrated, or was produced from a blade that had serrated tool marks. And the force of the blow, as illustrated here with this green arrow, traveled from left to right.
All right, and the bottom, well, I don't want to change that because the green arrow. The bottom image on States Exhibit 180E, what is that of?
This is a close-up of E right here, and you can see I actually wrote E in my initials. The green arrow illustrates the direction of the action that occurred, and then right here the black arrows are just illustrating that you can see these teeth-like structures that are kind of coming out of the bone. Again, most consistently produced with a bladed type tool that has serrated teeth.
Did you take any other actions in reviewing the tool marks A, D, or E?
Yes, I did. I just made observations to identify any individual characteristics if they existed within those tool marks. I was unable to identify any of those individual characteristics.
Okay. Looking at States Exhibit 180F. What portion of the bone does this depict?
That is an intact portion of the spine.
And why did you take a picture of the mark labeled as, I believe it's labeled as A in Exhibit 180F?
Okay. So this is item 17. So what I did was I just started over the count. So this is A for item 17. The tool mark here is produced from a chopping type action. As the green arrow indicates, the force of the blow, as far as this illustration is concerned, came from the bottom up.
What did you notice significant with this tool mark?
It didn't travel through the hard layer of that bone. It's difficult to see in the image, but this is not a flat surface. This portion of the bone right here,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, is kind of coming out. So this portion here is much higher in elevation than this tool mark.
All right, and what other actions did you take in reviewing or analyzing tool mark A on this portion of the spine?
Just that I was trying to identify any individual characteristics within that tool mark, and I was unable to find any.
Okay. And with regard to the bottom image on State's Exhibit 180F, what is that?
It's just the same image, just magnified. And it just illustrates, or you better see that how the tool mark or the tool used didn't pierce that hard layer, and that you can actually see fractures or pieces of the bone that were actually carried into it.
And State's Exhibit 180G. What item was this identified as by your lab?
This was labeled as item 19.
Okay, and what portion of the bone does this depict?
It is the other half of the hip or pelvic region.
So this is a different portion of the hip bone or pelvic region than was identified in item 16, correct?
That is correct.
And can you walk us through your analysis of this bone with the marked areas?
Okay. Would there be some, if we can actually bring down some of that brightness?
Let me see.
We can't, right?
The light off.
Oh.
Does that help?
Yes, that's perfect. So I'll start from the left side here. D is was created from a chopping type action. That damage from the blow actually pierced that hard layer of the bone. Next to it is E. F here, which is kind of difficult to see. You can see it. But what I'm trying to outline here, and you can actually see it, there's a, well, before I go into that, one of the things I wanted to also show you was there was what I believe were soot marks along here. So part of the bone was damaged, I believe, due to fire. But right here, F, you can kind of see these fracturing kind of coming around here, this little region right there. I was unable to find any tool marks, but it did appear that some type of force was applied to it, which I used as compressive force. Force down on it here, perpendicular, kind of driving this fragment downward, but it was still attached to the bone. Over here on the right, G, you can kind of see this outline here. I was unable to identify any types of class characteristics from it, other than the fact that some type of force was applied onto it, and it just drove in there. And in H, right here, in this, all these G, D, and E, if I didn't mention, were from a chopping type action. I'm sorry, G was compressive force, D and E, chopping type action. H, that was from a stabbing type action, you can, it's difficult to see, but you see this little channel here? It appears that something was driven into that, and it caused a channel to occur within that hard surface of the bone.
And with regard to the compression action, are you able to tell what type of tool was used?
No, I was not.
And with the other, I think you said, chopping type actions, are you able to identify what type of tool was used?
Not identify, but tool marks are consistent with. Would it be possible for me to save that when we do the close-up images?
Sure.
I think it would be easier to illustrate.
Absolutely. States Exhibit 180H. There are 3 images on this page. Do you recognize those?
Yes, I do.
And with regard to the top photograph, can you just explain that for the record?
You can see the digital box I drew around the tool mark. It kind of looks like a tooth mark, or kind of like a shark's tooth standing up here. The green arrow is based on the top of it. Here's the base. Right here, I actually wrote on the bone A in my initials. What's hard to see in this image is there's more elevation right here. So this occurred from a chopping type action. As the green arrow indicates, it came from the top down. But since this bone was protruding out, had higher elevation, that chopping type action did not cut into the hard layer of that bone. And also I reviewed it for individual characteristics and found none. I believe tools consistent with potentially making this kind of marks would be from a blade tool such as a cleaver, machete, hatchet, or similar type tools.
Did you note anything else as significant with regard to these tool marks on this top photograph?
For B and C, I wasn't able to identify any class characteristics, and I just referred to them as fractures. You can see that the bone, some type of force was occurred onto it, and it actually fractured that bone here as well. It may have occurred from the same impact, but I wasn't able to determine that. And I was unable to determine any kind of tools that would be consistent with making that type of damage.
Thank you. With regard to the bottom images, why did you take a closer-up picture of those?
Those are just zoomed in images of B and C, just to better illustrate the fracturing that occurred to the bone. So you can actually see how the bone is cracking and fracturing, and you got bone that's spurring out from that pelvic bone.
What other actions, if any, did you take in reviewing or analyzing these tool marks identified on this bone?
Other than just trying to identify any of those individual characteristics, which I was unable to locate any.
Okay. And then turning to State's Exhibit I. What does that top photo depict?
Okay, so you can see part of my initials here, but just to make sure that they were, I actually wrote on my notes. So that is D, my initials, scribbled, and then the date. But what this image illustrates here is a close-up of damage to region D. As I indicated earlier, it's from a chopping type action. The force of the action occurred, at least in the image, from left to right, kind of coming upward. What this illustrates is you can see the fracturing that's occurring from the bone right here, where basically the force of the blow carried over this portion and underneath this side. It cleaved through the hard layer of that bone.
All right. Did you notice anything else of significance or take any other actions in reviewing or analyzing this tool mark noted as D on this portion of the bone?
I also was looking for the individual characteristics, which I was unable to find any.
Okay. And on the bottom photograph, can you describe that for the record?
Okay. So this is D in its entirety, and next to it is E. Here is F. As you recall, that's the one I said I couldn't find any class characteristics, though some type of force, compressive force, was administered on it at this point, which kind of caused it to fracture along this area here. But what I want you to focus on is E. Sorry. E right here. It's the same kind of action coming from left to right, a chopping type action. However, there were what appeared to be teeth-like protrusions coming out of it that are consistent with a chopping top action from a tool with serrated teeth. This one did not pierce through the hard layer of the bone.
And did you take any other actions or find anything else of note in analyzing the tool marks identified as D, E, and F in this photograph?
The only other actions I took was just to try to identify individual characteristics. Was unable to locate any.
Thank you. State's Exhibit 180J. And can you walk me through the marks that you have on this larger picture first?
Yes. So this is a G. You can see right here, I've written on the bone, G, my initials. You could kind of see the outline of the impressed mark. As I mentioned earlier, I was unable to associate any class characteristics with it other than some type of compressive force was applied to it to cause this impression to occur. Up here at the top, H, this came from a stabbing type action. This was the one from the first illustration I talked about that a little channel had been formed underneath the hard layer of the bone. You could actually see this is the orifice of it. It is pretty small. I actually hand wrote on it. It's approximately 0.058 of an inch in diameter, so pretty small.
What else did you find noteworthy regarding the tool marks observed on this portion of the hip bone?
I attempted to take a cast, so this was my final cast of the casting material. I applied it, hoping to capture some kind of class, maybe even individual characteristics. I was unable to do that. Can I speak to the other images on the right?
Yes, that's going to be my next question. With regard to the top right photograph, what is this closer image of?
So that is just a closer image of H right here. I just kind of zoomed into it just so you can kind of see. Here's the orifice. The green arrow indicates the force of the blow occurred here, and you can see behind it some of that channel that occurred from underneath that hard portion of the bone. And again, my initials.
Did you take any other actions or find anything else significant with regard to this puncture type mark on the bone?
I did not.
Okay. Regarding the lower image, why did you take a closer image of the tool mark identified, I think, as G in that portion of the hip bone?
I just wanted to illustrate it. It was all the images I took up until that time. It was very difficult to see it in image. So all I did here was I was just casting different lights, and so it just kind of casted a shadow, so you're kind of able to better see that outline of that damaged region. So that was my motivation behind actually trying to take that image, or taking that image.
Thank you. Did you take any other actions or find anything else worth mentioning in analyzing these tool marks?
No, I did not.
State's Exhibit 180K. This appears to be an overview of all three bones that you analyzed. Is that right?
That is correct.
And what's significant in this image?
This is the only image, or one of two images I have for my notes, that illustrate all the bones in an illustration. So it basically provides you the totality of the tool marks that were imparted onto these bones. On the left side, you can see right here I wrote item 19. So this whole bone here is item 19. Item 17 is the portion of the spine. Item 16 is this portion right here. And all I did was I just illustrated in it all the different locations. So tool mark A, B, A, and then of course along here.
And can you point out any of the images that you were able to identify, either class or individual characteristics for the tool marks?
So for any kind of chopping type action, I didn't identify any tools, but I determined tools that are consistent in class characteristics as causing, in this case, a chopping type action. That would be A here, chopping type action. A on item 17, chopping action. D and C, chopping type action, as well as B on item 16. Item 16, A would be from a stabbing type action.
Okay. And then the last image, State's Exhibit 180L. This is the backside or posterior of the bones that were pictured in this last image. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and what did you find noteworthy with regard to the bones in this picture?
Again, just trying to illustrate the totality of those tool marks. This bone here is item 16. D and A, those are just injuries that are transferred from the front side to the back side. So you can actually see part of the bone was being almost ejected from the back side. Same with D. Recall A here was a stabbing action, D chopping. E here was that chopping top action with a serrated tool marks. And then item 17, you can't see the injury from the backside. Item 19, F, that fractured part. So again, you kind of see the outline of the fracture. E and D, it's from a chopping type action. G was as that compressive force, the one where I was unable to identify any kind of class characteristics, the one I just took the cast of. And then B and C were those fracture type marks, which again I wasn't able to associate with any kind of class characteristics.
Thank you. Can you summarize your findings or give us a nutshell of your findings with regard to the tool mark analysis you performed on these three bones?
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, the examination process goes from class characteristics, generating different types of source populations for the examination portion, so moving into that identification. I was never actually able to go there in order to go to that second, that microscopic examination would require me to have individual characteristics, so I never really got there. So the only thing I was allowed to do or able to do with those class characteristics was basically just outline tools that could have produced those tool marks consistent with. Could we go back to the slide prior? Okay. So, item 16A, that came from a stabbing type action from a bladed tool such as a knife along the tip. However, I wasn't able to preclude some type of other bladed tool where a portion of a corner of that tool, like a cleaver, may have been used. But again, from a stabbing type action, most consistent with a bladed tool with a tip on it. B, D, and C on item 16 came from a chopping type action. Tools consistent with a chopping type action, consistent with these class characteristics, would be a cleaver, a machete, or a hatchet. Recall some of them actually had what appeared to be serrated teeth marks, or consistent with being created from serrated teeth marks. So some of those chopping type tools may have had serrated type teeth marks on them. A, chopping type action. A with item 17, the portion of the spine. Chopping type action consistent with tools such as a cleaver, machete, hatchet. A on item 19, same type of chopping type tools, cleaver, hatchet, machete. And then B right here, I believe was from the fracturing, so no determination could be made, no class characteristics were collected from that.
And Mr. Halapaska, you were not provided any tools in an effort to match the marks to a specific knife or hatchet or cleaver, is that correct?
That's correct. No tools were administered in this case, only the bones. And could I, see the other half, and I'll kind of go through
The posterior or the backside?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Again,
what did you note as significant, or summarize your findings for us with regard to the posterior side, please?
Okay. Again, this is just damage from A, transferred from that stabbing. D, from the chopping. E right here was from a chopping type action, had the serrated teeth marks, again, cleaver, machete, hatchet, or similar type bladed tools. Item 19, I wasn't able to make any determinations for F, G, and then B and C, no class characteristics I was able to obtain from those examinations. E and D, chopping type action, consistent with bladed tools such as cleaver, machete, hatchet, and I believe one of those had perhaps serrated teeth marks in it as well.
All right, Your Honor, may I have just one moment?
Yes.
I don't have any other questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, Ms. Rawlings. Who will conduct cross? Is that you, Mr. Thomas?
I will, Your Honor. Could I have Exhibit 180, the packet?
Yes.
Good morning, Mr. Halapaska. How are you?
I'm doing good. Yourself?
Good. You work for the FBI. Are you an FBI agent or an analyst, or what do you call yourself?
I'm not an agent. I'm a physical scientist, forensic examiner.
Okay. And as far as your educational background, are you a doctor, or are you a master's level or bachelor's level?
I have a bachelor's of science, which I received from Texas A&M University in 2001. I'm currently attending the National Intelligence University at Bethesda, Maryland, where I'm pursuing a master's degree in science and technology and intelligence.
Okay. National Intelligence University?
That's correct.
Is that a private university, or is that run by the FBI, or is that... I guess I'm just not familiar with it. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
It's a federal level university. It's I believe up until very recently it was run by the Department of Defense.
Okay. And can anybody take classes there, or is it specifically for government agencies?
You have to have a top secret clearance. In order to take
Okay.
classes there, so it's not
for everybody.
Yes, mostly just for federal employees, but there are contractors that work there as well.
Okay. All right. And what are you studying at the National Intelligence University? What kind of things do you study there? Mostly tool marks, or?
No forensics. It's just focused on science and technology, basically emerging technologies. Just studying that, just to be aware of any kind of disruptive technologies that may be coming up that the forensic community might have to actually deal with in the not too distant future.
So computer type stuff, or digital type stuff, rather than hands-on bones and whatnot?
Nothing concerned with bones. Mostly things like additive manufacturing, which is just a different name for 3D printing.
Oh, okay. All right.
Mr. Thomas, I apologize for the interruption. There's been a request that we take the morning recess at this time.
Perfectly
We're just
okay.
getting started, so
Sure.
why don't we go ahead and do that. We'll be on a recess here for 20 minutes, and then you can continue with your cross. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
That's the latest in segment number 1. Segment number 2 is on the way next. Press subscribe so you don't miss any of our continuous coverage from the trial of Lori Vallow Daybell right here.
This is continuous coverage
Continuous coverage.
in the trial of Lori Vallow Daybell from the Hidden Killers podcast.
Hidden Killers Podcast.